Okay, I think we're rolling. Hopefully that's the case. Welcome everyone to what I'm calling Holistic Agroforestry. The subtitle here is a holistic permaculture approach to conservation. I am absolutely beyond excited to get to talk with y'all about a subject very close to my work and heart, agroforestry, working with the woods in some capacity or another. But before we dive in, before we talk about the agenda, what we're wanting to discuss today, I'd like to share a small bit about us, our work, our backgrounds, just to give you guys some context for the rest of the conversation. Okay, so my wife and I own and run both Timshel Permaculture and the Robinia Institute. Timshel is a 300-acre regenerative permaculture farm. I'll dive into a little bit of what we do and how we do it. And then the Robinia Institute, we're an educational institute here in Central Virginia and are working to become a savory hub in June of 2020, teaching holistic management and regenerative agriculture to the local community here. So Timshel. Timshel Permaculture, we're a regenerative and holistically managed permaculture farm here in Nelson County, Virginia, Central Virginia, where we're growing nutrient-dense foods, phytochemically rich foods, healthy soil, biodiversity on organically managed, sustainable, carbon sequestering pastures and forests. So that's what we do. What we raise, excuse me, we raise 100% grass-fed and finished heritage beef, holistically foraged and heritage pork, 100% free-range goat dairy, which is a lot of fun. We have a bunch of goats just running around willy-nilly. Pastured eggs, we have 100% grass-fed and finished lamb as well. We also manage about 20,000 square feet of veggie production and about 2 acres in food forests and orchards. This is a picture of one of our favorite cows, Branya, just enjoying some Johnson grass there in July, August sun. But really, in other words, Timshel Permaculture, we're just very busy having way too much fun. That's a little bit of background there. For time's sake, we'll keep moving. The Robinia Institute. Okay, this is our educational center that operates here at Timshel. Timshel is our demonstration site and land base. We are Virginia Hub candidates with the Savory Institute. We work closely with Alan and his team to educate, advocate, and promote the supreme abundance of a holistically managed and well-designed ecosystems. We have courses, events, apprenticeships, webinars, and do consultations for large and small farms all across the U.S. So that's a bit on us. That was quick, that was high level, but it should give you a glimpse, a little bit of an overlook on who we are and what we do. We're experienced farmers and we're experienced educators, and we do our best to relay what nature has given us. That's as simple as it is. And so with that, let's jump into a quick agenda, a lecture overview. Quick side note, I hate lectures. I hate talking to the computer, so bear with me as this is going to be a little bit jumpy. I'm going to stumble a little bit more than I would like. I like interacting with audiences. I like to see your reactions, to answer questions. And so I understand the difficulties of the times, the necessity of what we're doing over the internet here online. But with that, just extend some grace to me as we stumble through this lecture. Anyways, the lecture overview, I want to start with some definitions. What is agroforestry? And then I want to jump into some philosophy. At the beginning of the talk of philosophy, it's going to feel a little bit, you're going to ask yourself, why are we talking about philosophy? I'm not even going to mention really the word agroforestry at this time. But it really is going to come down to the whys. Why is agroforestry important? Why is our philosophy, our understanding in regard to agroforestry important for both the design and the implementation process of our work with the forest? And then we'll dive into some examples, how we are doing it, either at Timshel Permaculture Farm, our 300-acre land base here in Central Virginia, or via the Institute, via consultations and other things we're doing. One last note before we jump into the lecture. At the very end, we're going to include some further resources. there's a lot of data, a lot of scientific, mathematical data that I really enjoy, that you will need to access and understand if you were going to implement some of these designs or work with the forest in any capacity. This lecture would be 5 hours long if I were to include them. And so what I've chosen to do is at the end, pass you towards some really great resources so that you can get those mathematical models yourself. But what I really want to achieve in this lecture is not to give you the math, not to saturate your mind with models, but really just to saturate your mind with the opportunity that we have as designers, consultants, farmers, permaculture practitioners in working with the forest in whatever capacity that means, either going into the forest or bringing the forest out to us. And so with that, let's begin. Okay, nature is neutral. I promised definitions, but a little sidestep here. First and foremost, this is something that is absolutely pivotal in everything that we do here at Timshel and Robinia. We have this plaster all over our centers, our offices, this library I'm sitting in. Nature is neutral. You know, when we walk into the pasture, my eyes are constantly going pasture grass, forb, weed. Cows eat grass, cows eat forbs, cows don't eat weeds. I'm classifying, right? I'm putting value on certain living species and not others. The same thing goes for the forest. I can walk in the forest, see a $7,000 valued white oak growing 30-inch diameter, 80-foot tall, it's completely knotless, it's the straight grain. You know, it's worth $7,000, but nature doesn't see that. Nature grows life. That's its purpose, right? It doesn't care if it's a $7,000 tree or a $7 tree. Nature is neutral. And so when we're trying to design natural systems, it's really important to have that really at the front of your brain, because what that does is it forces you to start with humility, right? And the assumption that maybe you're wrong, right? If nature is neutral, then us walking into the forest with our predefined values, it needs to stop before we get to the forest, right? And so we have to start with humility. That's really all that means. We'll come back to really what that means at the end of the lecture, and hopefully it makes a little bit more sense at that time. Okay, some definitions. Agroforestry. This might seem overly simplistic, but if you were to pick up a book on agroforestry today, you will see some people argue that it has 6 parts: alley cropping, riparian buffers, silvopasture, windbreaks, forest gardening, and forest farming. I believe those are the 6 that you'll find. That's fine, but we're not going to take a textbook definition and limit the word of agroforestry here. I don't see a purpose for that. What I want to do instead is use this time to broaden your understanding, as I've already said, not to limit the definition by some human conception of what agroforestry means. And so for our working definition, simply, it's just the agriculture of the forest, agroforestry, agriculture, forestry. Whatever that means to you in your designs, in your context, let that be agroforestry. There's no reason to limit that. That said, I do really value D.P. Gritty's agroforestry definition. If you've never read this essay, The Vision of Land Care, I would encourage you to Google that and read it. It's really a great essay. But Gritty defines agroforestry as a dynamic, ecologically based natural resource management system that, through the integration of trees on farms and in the agricultural landscape, diversifies and sustains production for increased social, economic, and environmental benefits. Wow, that is a healthy definition with a lot of words that we can really unpack. But what I want to do is quickly pull it apart, understand the different facets, really defluff the thing, take a lot of the words out, and really actually look into a couple of these words to really talk about what we're now going to talk about is philosophy. Okay, so this is the same definition with a lot of the fluff taken out. So agroforestry is a complex, ecologic, and natural system for social, economic, and environmental abundance. That is a definition, or at least an understanding of agroforestry that I highly, highly, highly enjoy for many reasons that we're going to dive into here. The first of which is understanding the word complex. You know, complexity, I have it written down here so I didn't forget it, but it comes from the Latin word plexus, P-L-E-X-U-X, plexus, meaning braided or entwined. It really applies to more physical properties like rope, like a braided rope, but therefore complexus. It means braided together, or interrelationship or interaction or interconnectivity. Complexus, interconnectivity. Charles Massey has this quote. Charles Massey is an Australian farmer and writer. He wrote the book, recent book, I believe it's published by Chelsea Green, Call of the Reed Warbler. If you haven't read it, I would highly encourage that book. It's absolutely amazing. But Charles Massey wrote that interconnectivity of elements is distributed over different hierarchical levels. First, within a system, and second, between a system and its environment. What Massey is really talking about is the difference between aspects and parts. Okay, so if you look at a part, and let's try to understand that, engines, for this example, have parts. Engines are made up of parts. They have carburetors, fuel pumps, etc. But when they break down, they need to be fixed. And to be fixed, they need complicated instruction sets. Let me say that a different way. Carburetors don't need properly aired tires to be a true carburetor, right? A carburetor is a carburetor, whether it's situated under your hood in a working engine or on a box on a shelf, you know, at AutoZone. So regardless of the carburetor's function, whether or not it's working in a real engine or in a box at AutoZone, it's still a carburetor. That's an understanding of a part. Nature doesn't work with parts. Instead, nature has what we call aspects. This means that nature consists of wholes within wholes. And each whole, although a proper whole within itself, is really just an interconnected and dependent whole on other wholes, or larger wholes, or smaller wholes. This complex reality, if you can grasp it, is what we call holism. One quick side note, really, to manage complex ecosystems via holism, it takes deep observation, because you're not just looking at a carburetor, you're looking at the wheels or the tires or the brakes or the, you know, you can keep on going with that analogy. They all work together for the sake of a greater whole. Going back to the idea that nature is neutral, it also takes patience and humility. If you open up a hood thinking you know everything involved in the complete interaction of all these different aspects, if you will, and you see them as aspects and not parts, you learn very quickly that you don't know much, right? And quickly you find yourself in a perfect state of humility. One of my favorite foresters, I'm going to read some quotes during this lecture. I love quotes. I think a lot of people say things a lot better than I do, and so I rely on quotes, of course. One of my favorite foresters and writers is a gentleman named Chris Mazer. He wrote a book that I'm going to recommend in the end here under the further resources. But he wrote that what we need is a collective dream large enough to encompass and transcend all of our small individual dreams in a way that gives them meaning and unity. He's talking about forestry here, but he's really talking about collective dreams large enough to encompass and transcend. He's talking about holism. In a quote just a couple pages later, he continues this thought, saying that it is a critical time, talking about forest stand management, really agroforestry of a closed canopy system. It is a critical time to reevaluate our philosophical foundation and to re-emphasize human dignity in management decisions. We can then broaden the philosophical basis of management to include forests and grasslands, rather than only a few selected commodities they produce. Just absolutely love that quote. What he's really arguing here for is a holistic agroforestry philosophy, not only that integrates ecosystems, right, forests and grasslands, but also sees the whole of each ecosystem as one great and continually adapting complex system. So that's complexity, that's aspects, not parts. Let's talk about this adaptation though, because that's really what Chris Mazur was shifting into. So ecologic activity, adaptive landscape genomics. Use that in a sentence on one of your consultations and you'll be seen as a professional in the space, that's for sure. Adaptive landscape genomics. All ecologic activity is adaptive, or has adaptive landscape genomics, I'll just say it that way. Anyways, I once heard a forester say that forests are ecosystems that are in perpetual adaptation. I think that's a really good definition. It shows the continual and ever-going succession of a forested ecosystem, really any ecosystem, but forests especially go through substantial adaptation. Before we unpack what that means, let's first make the note that adaptation is a really weird word. It is reactive in that you can adapt to changing circumstances. I understand that. But the weird part of the word is it could also be proactive. So it's reactive, but it could be proactive, as adaptations produce network effects of other adaptations that then foster further genomic adaptations that are one day perceived as normal. Some foresters and I are in the conversation that when we walk into a forest, we see trends, right? We see patterns and we think those are normal. But what really is normal? If forests are ecosystems, right, in perpetual adaptation, then us perceiving an adapted form as normal is actually incorrect. It's an adapted form. It's only relative to this space-time history that is normal, but it's going to quickly adapt out of that normalcy, right? By the time that decisions are made, or generations change, or ecosystems change, or the climate changes. For example, if that's a little bit too in the clouds for you, I want to give you this quick example here. So one of the few animals truly native to the North American landscape, actually it emigrated from the South American landscape, but that's a different story, was a giant ground sloth. It was called the Megatherium. It went extinct at the end of the Paleocene era about 12,000 years ago. So it's a distant native animal to the North American landscape, but it was here for many thousands of years. It was one of the largest ground mammals that ever existed, much bigger than modern elephants and weighing upwards to like 4 to 6 tons, depending on the gender. It's believed to have been predominantly a forest living animal, consuming leaves, twigs, and select grasses. When you're talking about adaptations and perceived normal behavior of a forested ecosystem or pattern of a forested ecosystem, it's important to recognize that our modern forests evolved for thousands of years in conjunction with elephant-sized animals running through their understories, climbing their branches and eating their leaves, right? I know of people today who argue that you shouldn't put cows in the woods because you're going to hurt the woods. If you do the math, cows are 1/8 the size of a Megatherium, right? A giant ground sloth. And they don't like climbing trees. They prefer grasses, not leaves. And so when you're talking about a forested ecosystem, you have to understand that they really are just continually adapting ecosystems, right? When you're designing landscapes, putting cows in the woods, for instance, you got to remember that the Megatherium is what this woods understands. And so a cow is a very small animal to be put in there. Now, we don't have to get into whether or not your cow should be in the woods, but the point is, when you're looking at patterns in continually adapting landscapes, your patterns are continually adapting, right? And that's just talking about these genomics that are really plastic. And that's what developmental plasticity really talks about. It's developing, but in a plastic relationship. It's going in and out, in and out. And to end here, really to impact what I'm trying to say, if it's not clear, and perhaps it's not, but our problem in seeing a young growth forest, less than 200 years old, is that we see it and we believe it's an old growth forest. I've been in conversation with folks who talk about, beautiful land and old growth forest, and you walk through it and there's not a tree over 100 years old. But to them, that's old growth because it's older than we are. Old growth forests are old. They're generations old. They're 200 plus years old. They're 1,000 years old, right? Let's see. And so when we're talking about agroforestry, we have to understand the true basis of ecologic ecosystem function, adaptation. But adaptation implies long-term succession, which is the last part of this definition I want to unpack. So forests agroforestry is a natural system, CCS. CCS stands for complex creative system. Long-term succession is this complex creative system. I'm going to rely back here on Charles Massey, where he argued in the Call of the Reed Warbler that complex creative systems have three different facets, three different parts. The first is co-evolution. Complex creative systems co-evolve. What this means is that aspects evolve and adapt in symbiosis and with long-term successional and within long-term successional systems. Really what Charles is arguing here is that nothing adapts, nothing evolves in isolation. Everything is adapting and evolving with something else. Therefore, it's co-evolving. The second point is what he called emergence. And this is a beautiful word that we could probably spend a whole day talking about, but it's really that aspects evolve and adapt seemingly at random. Yet this emergence produces novel properties that are beyond what we ever could have designed for. In a sense, I guess, by managing for emergence, you are managing in a way that releases control over nature and allows for true abundance. And so an example of emergence is on our farm, we don't castrate any of our animals. We don't wean or separate any of our animals. And so what we're trying to do is keep the hormone system intact of all of our species, be them cows or goats or whatever, pigs. And we're trying to keep the familial lineage also intact. And the example is that one day we were trying to tag a calf that was just born. And the mom was protecting the calf, as a good cow should, not letting us tag it. But it wasn't just the mom. It was that cow, the cow that just had the calf. It was that cow's three previous calves. One was 3 years old. The next was 2. The next was 1. All standing in a line in front of the mom, protecting the baby. It was this massive family unit protecting the family unit. And this is in a pastured ecosystem. These are cows, right? But just by simply not castrating, allowing or weaning or separating, but allowing the animals to exhibit true natural instinctual behavior, right? We allowed a pattern to emerge that provides increased predator protection, right? I can't even, a human that they know and love, they like the fresh grass that I bring them to, but they won't even allow me to touch the calf, let alone a predator. And we could, obviously unpack that much further, but the point is when you release control, when you allow ecosystems, complex creative systems to emerge, abundance follows that is so much beyond what I could have ever designed for. And that's very beautiful. The last point here is self-organization. Aspects evolve and adapt together and via new patterns and behaviors within which arrive, I should say, from within and not from without, right? So adaptations don't always occur from external stimulus. Sometimes they occur from internal stimulus or desire or need, and that's what we call self-organization. We don't have to go too deep in this, but really the idea here, if you're going to take anything away or write anything down, is what we call open-ended creativity. Right, that's talking about emergence a little bit, but it's really talking about self-organization. That when you perceive ecosystems, especially agroforestry-based ecosystems, as complex creative systems, the creativity potential is unbounded. There's no ceiling, but you have to start again with humility. Right? Nature is neutral. If you're going to manage a complex creative system that's evolving and adapting in itself, seemingly at random, right? But also with all of these different parts, holism, as we described earlier, you just have to start with humility. You are so small and your designs are so minuscule in terms of the abundance potential that ecosystem has, that it's just absolutely paramount to start with that humility. I feel like I'm repeating myself with the humility thing, but hopefully you guys are getting it. Wonderful. Okay. And so what this really needs is management, but it also needs boldness. I want to take a quick sidebar here and note that this may all sound too philosophical to you. This is a lecture on agroforestry, and I haven't mentioned really any agroforestry methods. I understand that, right? So you thought, we'd be on the forest floor, and yet I'm on, in the clouds. But what I want to get across with this philosophy, this quick discussion on holistic philosophy, is that we're about to step into a very hard space, right? There's going to be chainsaws in your hand. Trees are going to hit the floor. Trees that live for 3, 4, 5 times the length that I will ever live. Trees that fed, thousands, if not millions of squirrels and birds and bears and bees and bugs, bacteria, fungi, and it's about to hit the forest floor. This holistic agroforestry philosophy is very important. How you understand and approach a forested ecosystem, again, whether or not it's in a forested canopy or in a silvopasture type setup, a backyard food forest, it doesn't matter. You're working with an ecosystem that your great, great, great grandchildren will harvest. We're talking about long-term ecosystem succession via complex creative systems that we cannot even come close to understanding. Right? I mean, how long has the human species been around? And just recently, in the past 10 years, we began to understand that trees are actually talking to each other. Right? We are just peeling back the beginning layers of this onion and understanding tree communities, agroforestry communities. What this management needs, therefore, what I'm saying is we need to be bold. We need to be humble, but we need to be bold. Before we get into examples, I just want to read this quick quote. This is from Chris Mazer. Again, I've mentioned him a couple times, but I just want to read this together because I think it's just absolutely beautiful. He writes that if we dare to dream boldly enough, our special interests will both create and nurture the whole, a healed, healthy, sustainable forest that includes old growth trees and wood fiber and wilderness, and native trout and clean water and. The point of agroforestry, right, is a diverse system that doesn't clear cut the entire forest for economic reasons. Neither does it leave the forest alone for ecologic reasons, right? We're going to be walking the perfect balance between ecologic abundance and economic abundance to create a landscape that is just, I mean, it's more than beautiful. It's supremely rich, desirous, ecologically and economically, but abundance is a word that I'm going to keep using and keep stumbling over, trying to find a better one, but I'm not. Create an economically and ecologically abundant landscape. That's agroforestry. Okay, so enough of me stumbling with words and talking about philosophy. I'm no good at it. Let's get into some practice, some examples. Beautiful. Got the yellow from our eyes, and now we're looking at blue skies. This is where I feel at home. Okay, the first example of an agroforestry system is what we call silvopasture. Silvoculture is a forest. Pasture is obviously pasture. Throw those words together, you get silvopasture. What you see here is an adapted keyline design. We don't have to go into great depth about this, but I hope now by this point in the PDC, you guys have learned about guilds or food forests. This is what we call a linear guild. As you can see, the lines here, I don't think you see my mouse moving, but those yellow tubes are what we call tree tubes, protecting seedlings that we planted this spring in a linear fashion. And I say adapted keyline design here because not just is it a linear food forest guild, but we took a keyline subsoiler and designed this system based off of a couple key lines in this pastured system so that we're moving water from the valleys to the ridges, from where the water wants to go to where the water never really goes, from a very saturated area to a very dry land area. Therefore, we're making this pasture more drought resilient, flood resilient, et cetera, et cetera. One quick last note here, you can see in the distance, there's a flock of sheep grazing. This system is a grazing system. And so what we've created here are alleyways in which we have our sheep and cows graze during the growing season. And as this system matures, these sheep and cattle are going to be able to harvest the tree fodder, right? So that's bark, that's branches, especially leaves, to increase their nutrition, the animal's nutrition. There's a lot of other there are a lot of other aspects of the system that we can talk about. Again, probably like everything here, I can keep saying I can talk an hour about this system alone, trying to give you some high level data on it, just to get your mouth watering a little bit, get you guys out there and designing it. So silvopasture, 6 quick items to talk about here. The first, and these are really, the benefits or how we get that abundance via the silvopasture system. One boils down to diversity. That's the most important part of any silvopasture system, in my opinion. I mean, when you're talking about diversity, it's a very diverse set of diversity. We're not just talking about nutritional diversity, but farmland use, right? You're opening up areas that may or may not have been accessible for farmland agriculture in the past, right? You're adding acreage into your farm landscape for no input. I mean, only time or maybe some equipment, but you're not having to buy more land, is my point. Diversity and carrying capacity. Putting additional forage, stacking forage vertically on the landscape, so you have your grasses and then your trees above it, you're going to be able to increase your carrying capacity. A pasture that only could carry, let's say, 15 cows can now carry 16, 17, 18 cows, right? Without, again, having to buy more land. And then the last one, obviously, is livestock diets. I mean, you're going to diversify your livestock diets with primary and secondary compounds. Primary compounds are minerals. Generally, I'm simplifying data here, but secondary compounds are phytochemicals, endophytes, tannins, et cetera. And so you're getting a much more diverse diet in your animals' lives. Therefore, healthier animals, happier animals, less stressful animals, but also just better food in the end for your family and your customers. When we're also talking about diversity, we're also talking about root systems, right? Creating microclimates above the ground, but also root systems below the ground. Grasses have a particular style of root system. Trees have a very different style of root system. And so diversifying the underground root systems is just as important as diversifying the above ground vegetative system, if you will. So just a quick note, couple notes on that. I mentioned microclimates before I move on to point number 2, which has really been talked about, and we're going to kind of jump around these points, I guess. But let's also talk about, I guess this kind of applies to number 2. Let's just talk about it as number 2, shade cover and therefore grazing potential. And so when you're talking about farmland use and you're talking about shade cover and grazing potential, with more shade, right, adding forest to the pasture, you can more properly graze high thermal banded areas, so south facing hillsides. Okay, I got where I'm at now. This makes sense. So this here is an NDVI map. NDVI stands for Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, NDVI map. This is some consulting technology that we have and use. But the real purpose here is to show you the photosynthetic activity of vegetative ground cover at any time. Here it's post grazing of cattle and sheep. The green you see on this map is vegetative ground cover, so pasture grasses and weeds that are still growing. They're still actively undergoing photosynthesis. The yellow is the middle ground. The red are obviously vegetative matter that are not growing. They're not undergoing photosynthesis. They're growing from the roots, meaning they have been grazed. What we do with maps like this is, we set up better silvopasture grazing systems based upon this data. So let's first understand this data. You can see where the red is, that's been properly grazed, it's heavily impacted. That's what we're looking for. That's the herd impact that we're managing for, I should say. But it's sparse. It's only located in particular areas in this pasture, and the pasture is outlined in that white dotted line. But what I want to get across to you is everywhere you see red, I know, because I know this field, there's a tree. There's a network of trees, really. Where you see green, there's no trees. Meaning that the cows, no matter how much I tried to force them into a high thermal band, high solar exposure area, they didn't care to eat. They were just going to stand in each other's shadows and wait to be moved, you know, a couple hours later or the next day. And so we're looking at a very low utilization of pasture forage based off of shade cover. And so if we add strategic silvopasture systems to this completely open areas of the pasture, we're going to be able to graze them moving forward. And again, if I can only put 15 cows in this field, you know, rotating them through the field, this field can only support 15 cows, adding that shade cover, we calculate here on this design about 33 to 40% of the vegetative matter is still intact. So I can increase my grazing pressure or the number of animals I have grazing by 33 to 40% just through including a silvopasture in just the shade category, let alone the forage additional and the additional forage capacity that gives me in, you know, bark and leaf material. This is how NDVI works. We don't need to get into it too in depth. But basically, you're just reading near infrared light from a drone aerial mapping tool that we have. Let me go back. Okay, so we've kind of talked about a number of these, bounced around a little bit. I thank you for dealing with that. Increased forage potential, kind of talked about that a little bit. Yield potential, this is something that I haven't mentioned. Good. If the field in this example only could hold 15 cows, if you plant a couple black locust trees, now you can start harvesting firewood out of that field, regardless of the diversity or shade cover, anything else that those black locusts could provide. You now have a field with animals and then heat for your fireplace in the winter. And so you're adding, you know, increased yield potential to systems that are currently only producing one yield, right? So you want to have a very complex system with multiple yields as a permaculture principle. And it's just good practice. Why not? The last bit here is a little bit contested. I'm going to say it anyways, because I really do believe in it, but it's carbon sequestration. And so research indicates that carbon stock, meaning the tons of carbon stored per hectare, is 8 times higher in a silvopasture system than open pastures alone. The reason it's contested is, what does an open pasture mean? How is it managed? Is it rotationally grazed? Is it rationally grazed? Is it adaptively grazed? Is it holistically managed? I don't really know. Neither does the research. But the point is, regardless if you believe it's 8 times higher or 2 times higher, the point is adding this stacked system, silvopastures, trees in the pasture, or adding pasture to trees, meaning bring the pasture to the forest or the forest to the pasture. Regardless of which way you're going, you're looking at an increased ability of this system to sequester carbon. And in today's world, that's just of, you know, supreme importance. Okay, just 2 quick pictures I want to show you. These are our cows in the shade grazing happily and with very little stress. Just a gorgeous, gorgeous picture. Look at that grass, just absolutely growing wonderfully here in the shade. And this is the opposite of example, right? So the cows have access, the cows and the sheep, as you see here in this picture, have access to a pretty large paddock size. They're all grazing in the shade of this white oak that's not even in their pasture. And just because I stood here for a while watching, this was last summer, they barely moved out of this shade. They only grazed as the sun wrapped around this white oak and the shadow wrapped with it. That's where they grazed. And so we don't even need, you know, drone NDVI mapping software to tell us that we're underutilizing our pastures exponentially in terms of what we really could be grazing. And so this is really where silvopastures, and in my opinion, in the temperate landscape, this is where they really come to be of extreme importance. Now, my experience is grazing animals, you could set up silvopasture systems and alley crop the rows, meaning if you have a row of trees here and a row of trees here, just plant, you know, crops in between. That's totally possible. I don't have any experience doing that. I'm an animal farmer, and so I won't speak to it. But there's other possibilities as well. Okay, here's an agroforestry system that you guys might not have thought of if I didn't have the context I have. From a land-based perspective, I never would be talking about this. But this is something that's very intimate into in what we're doing. And the idea is regenerating a cutover or clear-cut land base using agroforestry techniques to heal it, right? And so I mentioned here you can capture cheap land. A degraded moonscape-like environment does not go for normal property value. You also can prevent herbicide spray. The next step here after logging this is to let it grow for about a year, spray an herbicide, then plant it in loblolly pine. And so you can prevent, by acquiring this land, you can prevent mass herbicide spray, and you get to also diversify the ecology, because the next step after herbicide, as I said, was a plantation of loblolly pine. Was talking to an apiary the other day, the biggest honey producer in our county, and he's moved all of their hives, out of our county because of the number of loblolly pine plantations. Loblolly pine plantations cannot support pollinators, just by definition. There's nothing really there to pollinate. And so this lack of diversity is actually forcing apiaries, bee farmers, honey farmers to pull out of our county into counties that have less clear-cutting logging systems going on. Just a quick side note, really interesting to think about. So cutover regeneration. Number one is utilizing ancient seedbeds, root systems, and deep, rich topsoil. You see here us pounding in these T-posts. What we're doing is we're fencing, really strategically fencing areas of this clear cut so we can use animal impacts, holistic animal impact to regenerate it, to bring back about a 30 to 35, keep burping on you, to regenerate, I don't know where I was, I'm gonna start over. Using holistic animal impact to bring back about a 30 to 35% canopy coverage, truly a silvopastured system, without planting trees or casting grass seeds. Really is just good management of animals. I was talking with Will Harris of White Oak Pastures back in January over dinner, and you know, they farm thousands of acres down in Georgia, South Georgia. And he made the comment that whenever he's looking to acquire new land, he's always looking for clear cuts and not pastures. Because pastures, they've been degraded and set stock for so many years that the grasses, they don't even want to grow. But a clear cut is an old forest, right, that has been only recently degraded, but its topsoil is still there. Its ancient seed beds are still in place, and its root systems are existent. I mean, it's a beautiful landscape if you could deal with a bunch of wood everywhere. This is a really interesting thought. The second point of cutover regeneration, really healing degraded landscapes via agroforestry techniques, is the idea that it's an open canvas. I mean, you're talking about an empty, open moonscape that allows you to design for whatever you want. I mean, you don't have to follow fencing mistakes of previous generations. You don't have to do any herbicide remediation or pesticide remediation. You don't have to take severely overgrazed pasture and yell at it to grow. I've been there. You can design from scratch, and so that's what we've really done here at this massive project that we're a part of. This is a 172-acre clear-cut regeneration project. 172 acres that were clear-cut, that we're transitioning over to an intensively managed agroforestry system that is both ecologically healthy, but also economically abundant, which is point number 3, is the cheap acquisition of land. All told, if done well, to set up this entire system, to purchase the land, to cut the roads, to add the fencing, to get the designs in place, you're looking at about $1,700 to $2,000 an acre. In our area of the world, land sells for $3,000 to $4,000 if it's decent. If it's good, bottom land next to the James River, cropland, it might sell for $5,000 or $6,000. And so coming in below 2,000 is very accessible, and it's a rich landscape. Again, if you can just deal with a bunch of stumps in your way, which we're asked a lot how it is, how we're going to regenerate this cut. Give you a high level. Basically, it's animal impact to knock down the first stage of succession, briars, brambles, things of that nature. And then we're just allowing all of the slash, meaning the tops of the trees that were left, big logs, sticks, and the stumps as well, just to decompose, turn into topsoil. We're hoping in about 10 years that it's a system of pretty high abundance. Obviously, the stumps will still be there. It's no problem. I'm happy for, wood to decay. I would have to buy, or beg local arborists for wood chips. It's all there. We just have to wait a little bit, have a little bit of patience. So that's Cutover Regeneration. It's using agroforestry to heal really moonscape environments. This is my dad and I, he's our farm partner, just looking at this clear cut. I mean, you see the level of growth at our feet. I mean, there's a lot of this is pokeweed, an incredibly high nutrient accumulating plant, deep taproot. That's what we're looking for to curb erosion. All this place needs is animal impact, manure spread, et cetera, and it really can actually be rich, really abundant and rich. So that's another agroforestry technique that we're using. Okay, the third here is food forests. I'm not going to dive too deep into this. I understand SPI has a pretty intense food forest understanding and curriculum. And so I'm not going to dive into too many different facets of food forests. I'm really just going to highlight two of them. It's the efficient management of landscapes, and also the sense that they're easy to manage, which is absolutely key when you're talking about the growing of food. I would rather watch my food grow than work to make it grow. That's just my opinion, but hey, you can pull weeds if you want. I would rather watch the food or watch the plants turn into food. Anyway, so efficient stacking functions in time and space. A food forest is really, in my opinion, built for this point. You have a lawn that's one space, but it's also one time. That lawn can only grow so much grass over a particular period of time. But when you stack functions and you're stacking layers on top of layers, you have canopies and subcanopies and bushes and and ground covers and herbs and then roots and then vines. You're using all of these different permaculture food forest layers to optimize a landscape to grow food in so much more abundance in the sense of time than you would if it was just an annual garden using market garden, 30-inch wide beds with 18-inch pathways. That space can only grow so much food over a particular period of time. It has a ceiling, right? It has a biotic cap, if you will. Food forests, although they do have a biotic cap, you can only stack so many things on top of each other. That cap is so much more efficient and so much higher than other agricultural methods. Also, when we talk about efficiency, it's really food forests call for earthworks, or really the mitigation of input, if you will. So here, we're looking at a picture. I'll go back so you can see it. These are raised beds. These are linear gilled food forests on raised beds that we topped off with way too much homemade compost and leaf litter and goat bedding and chicken manure and cow manure and everything else as cover. And then in here we have trees and bushes and 30 different species of plants. There's about 450 comfrey plants planted into those beds there, just busting out our eyes with comfrey. If you ever see one of our designs, it's comfrey. I love comfrey. anyways, so that's really efficient when you're talking about water management, nutrient management, nutrient cycling. It's all done in place. You rarely have to import nutrients into a food forest like you have to in a market garden. And so that's the efficiency that we're talking about. The second point, easy to manage, I mean, is just plant your weeds and eat them too. That's one of the sayings we have here on our farm, and we use in all of our work. There's no reason to pull weeds. I mean, I guess if you want to do a market garden and that's your thing, that's fine. I plant weeds and then I eat them because the weeds I plant are edible. Nature is neutral, right? Going back to that, if nature is neutral, it's going to want to grow something. So you might as well have it grow something that you're going to be able to eat, or that is good for animals to eat, or it's a good chop and drop plant, for green, manure to just chop, drop right in place and cycle those nutrients. And so plant your weeds and eat them too. I love that quote. This is a food forest design. This is actually the food forest we were just looking at. We just implemented it this spring, and so there's nothing really to show you other than just a bunch of raised beds and tree tubes. But this is the design. You can see layers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We also have, oh, that's labeled wrong. Anyways, there's only 5 layers. We have pollinating ground covers, shade pollinating ground covers, shade tolerant, meaning pollinating ground covers. This design goes into a lot of things. But just to show you the diversity, I'm looking at the right. I have a big screen that I can actually read on because the screen that you guys can see in front of me is small. But I mean, you're looking at American black walnuts, native black locust, Shangri-La mulberry is a beautiful white mulberry variety. You're looking at the pollinating ground cover. I mean, we got butterfly weed, purple coneflower, red standing cypress, blazing star, wild lupin, scarlet sage, spiderwort, sweet, or 4 o'clock, Indian blanket, Siberian wallflower, and go on and on and on. The shrubs that have been planted in here: American elderberry, black currant, serviceberry, jostaberry, indigo bush, seaberry, which is buckthorn. Anyways, we can read all of these things and let our mouths water all day. But the point is, a food forest, you're allowing these functions to stack. And so you're allowed to plant so much more than you ever could. But it's so easy to manage because most all of these plants are perennials. You plant them once, you give them a system in which they thrive using earthworks and other chop and drop, well-designed pattern methods. And you just harvest. I mean, you could propagate, you can prune, you can do whatever you want. You can add plants, take plants out, allow the animals to come through to self-harvest and impact the systems. You can plant more varieties. How you manage a system is up to you, but typically that management is pretty easy. And I mean that from a human scale perspective. And so it's a very special ecosystem. Definitely one of the funner agroforestry methods, because what you're doing typically creating a food forest is you're taking a lawn and turning it into a food forest. 9 times out of 10, I'll take a lawn and turn it into a food forest. The only time I wouldn't is if I wanted to put a little playground for my kids. Other than that, the food forest is an amazing playground, and it also feeds you, and it provides windbreaks, and it does amazing other things that I won't get into. You can read a lot more in the further resources if you want to dive into a food forest transition from lawn. I'll show you some books at the end that makes that a little bit more accessible than I can make it in this lecture. Okay, so we're talking about planting trees. Now let's talk about falling trees. This is a little bit more complex. I'm going to ask you to stick with me. Some people don't like the idea of falling trees or using them for lumber. This is a good friend of mine sawing this massive tree as a mobile hydraulic bandsaw mill that we utilize quite often. But the idea here is timber stand improvement. This is an agroforestry method of working with an already closed canopy system, right? So a forest in the true sense, a true woodland. But we're looking at lumber production that is ecologically and economically sound. We're not just taking trees. That's not the point. If we were just going to take trees, we might as well be clear-cut loggers. It's not what we're doing here. So we're not even select cutting. We're taking when we need, when economics and ecologic desires, if you will, meet. Quick point, if I need to sell some people in the very beginning to open some ears, I have a good friend of mine is a sustainable logger, if you will. He owns a very similar setup than we see here on the screen in the mountains of Arkansas. And he has found over the past 4 or 5 years that he's been able to harvest $5,000 worth of lumber products per acre per year. And so if you have 100 acres of woodland, this gentleman is able to ecologically and economically heal your landscape and produce $5,000 per acre per year. So if you have 100 acres, do the quick math and understand the economic abundance that can come out of the woods by doing it in a very holistic permaculture way. So let's dive into that, what that means. This is our team working in a timber stand. A timber stand is just defined as an area of the forest with similar trees or similar growth or similar topography orientation. It takes a number of different definitions. This here is a south-facing cedar forest. Most of the trees in this wood are cedar, eastern red cedar. There's a tree in the background, if you guys can pick it out. It's a black cherry. It's all scraggly and somewhat ugly looking, you know, as compared to the red cedar. But typically you're looking at most red cedars. Quick observation from this picture, you see a lot of cedars. You see one cedar growing straight, a lot of cedars on the ground, about an equal amount of cedars almost on the ground, and the rest of the cedars are pretty scraggly. This is what we call overstocking, or the basal area. BASAL, I think is how you spell that. Basal area has reached its potential. So let's really dive into what that means. So going back to the beginning, going down to the foundation of timber stand improvement, temperate forests, okay, are bound by biomass benchmarks, okay, site-specific resources and distinctive microclimates. So biomass benchmarks is you can only produce so much mass in terms of life. Life can only reach a certain potential, right? There's a biotic cap. Site-specific resources, meaning that all the trees in this forest need water and sunlight and air to grow. The denser the forest, the less air, the less sunlight, and the less water that the forest floor has in order to photosynthesize. But also distinctive microclimates. In a cedar forest, it's shade all year around. And so only certain species of trees want to grow in this environment. And so you're working with those 3 different facets of forest ecology when you're looking at a timber stand. What I'm really trying to say in effect is that a forest's biotic cap is determined by place, kind, and time. Okay, so how much of what can live when? I'll say that again. How much of what can live when? And so this means that a particular timber stand can only support a given number of trees of a given species for a given period of time before Mother Nature steps in and, you know, really tries to reduce the resource pool. What I'm trying to say is Mother Nature will start to kill trees, as you see in this photo, if its biotic cap is reached. And so when we teach agroforestry courses on our farm that deal in timber stand improvement methods, we take the class into the forest, and I stand next to a tree that I know is there. It's one of my favorite trees. It's a beautiful 30-inch diameter white oak. It's about 80 feet tall, pretty much not a single branch. Therefore, it's not free lumber until the very top. If you were to fall this, custom mill it, and sell it as veneer lumber, you would make between $5,000 and $7,000. This one tree is worth $5,000 to $7,000. And I stand there, and there's a patch of sweet gum, a economically more or less worthless tree growing up next to the white oak. I make the comment that if biotic caps are real, if the forest can only grow so many trees per timber stand, right? If basal area, and again, look that up and define it, you'll understand it pretty quickly. If basal area has been reached, nature is going to start to kill trees. That's what's going to happen. And so nature, being neutral, again, bringing it back to that idea, is going to kill either the white oak or the gums, but probably the white oak, because the white oak needs more nutrients than the gums do to grow. It's much bigger, it's much taller, et cetera, et cetera. And so nature may kill a $7,000 tree to protect a $7 tree. And so if you're a landowner, you own a forest, you're paying taxes in the forest, right? You have health bills, you have car insurance, you have gas to pay in your car so you can get to work, or the market if you're selling, produce and you're a full-time farmer. You need $7,000, you don't need 7, right? And so the understanding here is that you fall the sweet gums in order to protect the white oak. That's the idea. That's an economic view of the forest. But what about ecologic? So that same course, we walk over to an ugly, scraggly, horrible, pretty much worthless black cherry. And we look at the black cherry and we say, okay, if this was growing next to our white oak, what would I fall? Half the class looks up and they say, fall the black cherry. And the other half, they don't understand the question. That black cherry is, from an economic perspective, near worthless as compared to a $5,000 to $7,000 white oak. The difference is black cherries, looking at it from an ecologic perspective, supports about 1,000 to 2,000 times the wildlife species in a forested ecosystem than a white oak could ever foster or feed. And so when you're making decisions in the forest, they can't just be economic. They have to be ecologic and economic. They have to be in that beautiful place where those two different facets come together and form symbiosis. Nature operates via symbiotic creative systems. Yes, trees talk to each other, but yes, trees are limited. Space is limited in which trees can grow. Something has to die. In this picture, we see death as much as we see life. The biotic cap, the growth ceiling in this forest has been reached. And so our job as the agroforester, managing this timber stand, is to find and select the growth that meets economic and ecologic desires to reach true abundance with a chainsaw. Maybe that's too general. Maybe I lost some folks. Maybe I didn't describe it good enough. The point is, timber stand improvement is selecting what lives and what dies. If nature is neutral and it's going to kill one thing over another because that's what it decided, then the timber stand improvement manager, right, my team in this photo, is in some sense playing God, right? That is the forester. They're playing God. They're deciding what trees live and what trees die. And that's a very, very hard process, right? After taking multitudes of classes into the woods, I've learned to ask the question in the end, who would pay me right now $5,000 to not fall this white oak and keep the black cherry? If I fall the white oak, I have to find $5,000 elsewhere, but I get to keep the black cherry, which is good for wildlife. Asked that way, most folks don't look at me, they look at the ground, they try not to connect eyes with me because no one has $5,000 to save a black cherry. That said, it's a difficult question because I've fallen neither. And so I haven't come to the conclusion myself. But the point here is that agroforestry is a question of conservation, right? Of ethical land use. I want to end this little section here with a quote from Aldo Leopold, an amazing author. If you've never read the Sand County Almanac, I would encourage you to do it. It's Aldo Leopold's greatest work. But he writes this quote here. I have read many definitions of what is a conservationist, and I've written not a few myself, but I suspect that the best one is written not with a pen, but with an axe. It is a matter of what a man thinks about while chopping or while deciding what to chop. A conservationist is one who is humbly aware that with each stroke he is writing his signature on the face of his land. So conservation isn't the act of not falling trees, of not impacting ecosystems. Conservation is defined with what one thinks about when considering to chop down a tree. Are you seeing just the economics or just the ecologics? Or are you finding the right balance, the right pattern design, the systems thinking, the whole holism, looking at the whole forest as a unique entity with unique entities made up, within it, and are then proceeding forward. And so, I argue that conservation is a paradigm shift from seeing nature as a product to exploit, to nature as a partner to heal, right? A shift from extraction to regeneration. That's agroforestry in the woods, looking at, timber stand improvement. Hopefully that was worth some of y'all's time. Again, as I said in the beginning, I am not a good lecturer. I have some notes in front of me, and sometimes I read from them, sometimes I don't, sometimes I get lost. But I hope you got something out of this lecture. Want to quickly end with just, again, nature is neutral. We have to start with humility and the assumption that we are wrong, so that we see the initial feedback loops, right? The leading indicators of our decisions, so that we can change behavior, change design, revise design, and re-implement as soon as possible. But really, humility is of vital importance if we're working with perennial and slow growth systems, right? When you're harvesting a tree or you're planting a tree, you're looking 3 or 4 generations ahead. Does this tree matter to my great-grandchildren? Don't fall it. Should planting this tree matter to my great-grandchildren? Plant it, right? Humility is of extreme need here. You're not planting a carrot to harvest it in 60 days or 90 days or whatever, the growth, maturity growth thing of the carrot is. I don't know. I hate planting annuals. And so I know nothing about planting carrots. But you're looking so many generations ahead that you have to start with deep humility and the assumption that you are wrong. Enough philosophy, some fun stuff here. I'm gonna leave this screen up for just a couple seconds so you can write these things down. But further resources that we have found vital in our work, either in understanding agroforestry and implementing agroforestry, designing agroforestry systems for ourselves or our consulting clients. The first is Silvopasture by Steve Gabriel, an incredible book with a lot of mathematical models and formulas. For instance, if you want to get 30 to 31% canopy coverage in a pastured ecosystem that you're turning into silvopasture, you need to plant trees every 9 inches or something. And then after year 2, prune out 50% of them, and you have all sorts of those models that you can operate with. The Redesigned Forest by Chris Mazur, I've quoted from this book multiple times in this lecture, is an amazing book. Very little practical knowledge. It's not going to tell you, the difference between a red oak and a white oak, or a scarlet oak or a red oak, or a red oak and a black oak. But you're going to get a lot of this philosophy, which in my opinion is much more important than understanding the difference between a particular tree species or cultivar. Nourishment by Fred Provenza. Very little to do with agroforestry, but an amazing book. And he talks a lot about the difference between primary and secondary compounds, which is really the diversity you're going to get out of silvopastured systems. Really highly encourage that. Holistic Management. No library is complete without this book by Alan and Jody. An amazing book. Goes into the ideas of what managing holistically means, how to do it, and what holism really, or how holism applies to any sort of management, but especially ecosystem management, natural systems, creative complex systems. Tree Crops by J. Russell Smith, an original beauty. You could say he's the OG, the original gangster of the agroforestry community. Early 1900s work talking about tree crops in especially hillsides on the eastern seaboard of the United States. But it goes into great depth of particular tree species and things like that. Then lastly, Creating a Forest Garden. This is a book by an English gentleman, Martin Crawford. Some of his understanding of the cultivars that in the book are a little bit off. We're not working in dark, rainy, cold, dreary England. We're in beautiful central Virginia here. But his understanding of how to create a food forest or a forest garden or different agroforestry techniques, in my opinion, it's unparalleled. The steps that he walks through and his understanding of earthworks and low input gardening systems, it's just really beneficial. And so with that, I'm sure there's many books that didn't include. I mean, there's about 2,000 books behind me. I didn't look through all of them to make sure that this was a full and complete list. But the point is here, I hope that this lecture gave you some insight into the definitions and philosophy of agroforestry, the what and the whys. That's the most important part. How you actually implement that what for the reason of the why to fit your context is up to you, or up to the goal set that you have. We run animals, and so linear gills and adapted keyline design systems where we graze the alleyways fits our context. That's a very good system for us. Large scale clear-cut regeneration projects where we're gaining access to 172 new pastured acres is absolutely vital, for the price and for the work that we're putting into it. Those systems might not be vital for you or your clients. And I understand that. It might just be a half-acre food forest that you spend the next 30 years of your life, designing, implementing, and managing. And that's all beautiful. So really start with your context. Use these resources as beginning roadmaps and, project plans, if you will, and go from there. Well, thanks, y'all. I got some chores to do. It's Saturday morning and the sun is just rising. So I'm going to tag off, but I'm sure if you guys have any questions, the SBI team, Ryan, Trevor, and Emily will put you in contact with me. I'm happy to answer the questions as needed. Thanks, guys.